Across Europe, the language of democracy, rights, and the rule of law remain central to how the European Union defines itself. But these values are being tested in practice, from pressures on judicial independence and civic freedoms to wider questions about foreign policy, war, and international law. The gap between principles and political reality is becoming harder to ignore. So, what are the European Union's core values, really? How resilient are they under the internal and external pressure? And what do current developments reveal about the EU's ability to defend its foundational principles and practice? To help us unpack these questions, today I'm joined by Dr. Berit Ebert, a political scientist and academic specializing in European Union law with a particular focus on gender equality, democracy, and the rule of law. She is a faculty member at Bard College Berlin, where she also serves as the Director of Public Programs and Strategic Initiatives. Her work examines some of the most pressing questions facing Europe today, from democratic backsliding in rights protection to judicial reform in Poland and the wider resilience of EU values under political strain. She holds graduate degrees from Aachen University and the University of Vienna, and her writing has appeared in a range of academic and public platforms. Dr. Berit, welcome to the Intelligence Spotlight.
Thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here, and I look forward to our conversation.
I'm very honored to have you in the program. To start up a conversation, I always ask questions that guest speakers normally don't expect, which are mostly not related to the topic, but it would be, what was the first thought you had today about the whole situation of the world?
I have to say that I'm still positively energized by what the election outcome in Hungary was. So that is very much on my mind and really gives a lot of hope for the future, and also kind of restored the confidence, perhaps not so much in institutions, but very much in the people.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. But for a lot of our audience, this might be also something that they want to know, okay, why you're having this thought. So I think for that, I want to pose the first question, and that would be that in every institution, especially democratic ones, they're always based on certain values, certain principles that they are governed by, both internally but also externally. So, what are the European Union's core values in practice? Not just papers, but I know on papers it could be so many different things. But what are the ones that are being practiced at the moment?
It's absolutely right that you say on paper it could be very many different things,
Yeah.
but one thing that is very important about the paper sometimes is where you find them. And
Right.
in the current Treaty of Lisbon with the European Union, you find them in the second article, which is basically the article that comes after the first article, logically.
Yeah.
And the first article states, we want to have a European Union. And then already immediately afterwards, you have the values.
Wow.
It wasn't always like that. When the whole entity was founded at the the European Community for Coal and Steel, it looked very different. It was focused on coal and steel, later on the economy. And, like values were not so much thought of.
Right.
And now you have democracy, human rights, the rule of law, equality for men and women, but also very importantly, when we think about democracy, rights for minorities. Because after
Right.
all, in a democracy, it's important that the minority has the chance to become the majority.
Mhm.
So these are in the treaties now, and they are there for a reason. I think over the course of time, as the European Union acquired more political competencies, and we can talk about this, or was
Yeah.
responsible for more political topics, the whole bloc had to function, and it became bigger. We had a
Mhm.
couple of member states in the beginning, and now we have 27. The UK left us, but it is what it is. Perhaps they regret it.
Mhm.
So that has to be managed. And if you think about the European Union mainly as an economic union, but with the key goal of preserving peace in Europe, right? This
Yeah.
was the ultimate goal. We do not want to have a Second World War again. We do not want to repeat the mistakes of the past. And we also want to be more binding than the League of Nations.
Right.
We actually want to have the ability to enforce the laws that we make.
Mhm.
that was sort of one of the original thoughts. And when there were still a few member countries, well, the governments came together. They basically, usually they discussed, they agreed on something, and that was it. As topics increased, member state numbers increased, you had to manage the whole entity. And this is
I
also why you
see.
have things like majority rule, where a certain amount of member states can actually outvote
Yeah.
another amount of member states. You have to keep the whole entity going. But if you think about long-term economic relationships, without the rule of law, without
Hmm.
an involvement of the citizens, without minorities being also involved in that economic entity, if you have something like European citizenship, also something we can talk about, because legally speaking, it's not really a citizenship, but still it's a kind of a right for market participation, well, then you have to ensure that everyone participates in that market. And this is very much, this means that you have the mechanisms to build long-term trust. And as we
Right.
see in the United States right now, for example, if these mechanisms do not function, well, trust declines and also
Yeah.
economic power declines.
Right. So do you think right now the EU is living up to those values at the moment?
There is this German expression of Jein, which is sort of in the middle between yes and no. I mean, you will find arguments for both sides.
I see.
And it also depends on political topic, and
Yeah.
it depends on the impact or the strength the EU actually has in that sphere. And there you will see a huge difference between economic politics and
Hmm.
foreign and security policy, for example.
I see.
In the economy, and we're looking right now EU internally with
Yeah.
the member states, they are really trying to enforce this. I would say because they have to keep up and maintain the economic relationships. If you have a free trade area, no customs, no internal trade obstacles, these countries have to trust each other. And we
Right.
see this very much, for example, in my specialty in gender equality. There is a very interesting argument that is actually really advancing gender equality, but not on the basis of, oh, we all have to be equal in terms of men and women or gender diversity or whatever, but it's very much argued on the basis of EU citizenship and the
I
free
see.
movement of EU citizens. So, for example, if I'm allowed to have a gender reassignment in one member state, the other member state has to accept that. And it doesn't
Mm.
mean, oh, the other member state has to recognize me as man or women or anything in between. This means the other member states have to also then implement everything legally and administratively that pertains to that. That might be residency rights, adoption rights, and so forth. This is
Hmm.
something that no one, when the whole thing was founded, was thinking about. They were thinking equality means same salary because we are
I see.
economic. And then you
Yeah.
build that up. And this is very clear. The European Union has a competency for that, for economic policy, and therefore it's very strong in that. Does
I
it have a
see.
competency in family and social policy? No. But since these topics are so closely aligned, the
Yeah.
argumentation via EU citizens, right, really gives it a very strong impact.
Right.
And this is also a policy field where the European Union, I mean, the economic
Hmm.
policy, where the European Union actually issues binding law, right? Everything that pertains to trade or whatever, you have the European Commission, a legal proposal, then you have the Council and the Parliament, they say yay or nay.
Yeah.
They renegotiate until something comes out of it. It can take very long, but at least you have an agreement between 27 members and the respective institutions. And these are EU institutions. And when we're talking about the council here, we're talking about the respective ministers. So if we're thinking
Uh-huh.
about environmental policy, the respective environment ministers will come. If we think about transport policy, the transport ministers will come and they will be there and will be debating about the commission proposal, and then parliament will be debating that
I
too,
see.
and they can each amend that. In foreign and security policy, it's a completely different animal. There is no commission at the origin. You always see right now there's the commissioner for foreign affairs, and then there is
Right.
Ursula von der Leyen as the president of
But
the
it has to
commission.
do more with the heads of states, right?
Yeah.
That are dealing with the foreign policy aspect of
Correct,
the EU.
correct. And it's basically Ursula von der Leyen as the president from the commission given an opinion about that. And so
Hmm.
does the foreign affairs commissioner do.
Yeah.
But it's the heads of states and government who actually come together, not necessarily as a European Union institution, but as representatives of their countries, and they
Hmm.
debate. And they all have to agree. This is why you had this interesting situation with Hungary when the country was blocking the financial aid for Ukraine and the potential credits, and then one country was able to block the entire community there because it was totally analogous to international organization logic, namely everyone has to agree. Like in the United
Yeah,
Nations, when a new treaty is being done, everyone has to agree. Which is, by the way, also the logic when a EU treaty is being amended. It's not the European
that's true.
Parliament, it's not the European Commission that is amending treaties. It's always the heads of states and governments that come together and one country, one vote. And this is also the principle that guides the logic in foreign and security policy, again, which has positive and negative sides to it. On the one hand, if everyone agrees, it's great. It's a really credible decision, right? If
I
you
say,
step
yeah.
outside to the world and everyone agrees, that's great. If someone is outvoted, well, for a foreign policy decision, perhaps this doesn't really make sense.
Hmm.
Or the decision is more prone to being attacked from outside enemies or what have you. It's also one other possibility is simply if you have a country that does not carry the decision, like Hungary, there would have
Hmm.
been always the possibility for some member states to say, okay, then Hungary, goodbye, then we do it alone. Right? That would have always been a decision. It perhaps would have looked a bit
But
strange
still,
to the
Hungary
outside
does have
world, but
the
it's there.
veto right.
Yeah. Yeah. So you
Which
can.
is which is quite interesting, especially when there was this tension, but at the same time, two countries were helping each other when it came to particular policies and sanctions. Poland as well, when there was some judicial reforms within the Polish system. Of course, a lot of them were not as democratic, and they were actually being influenced by other actors, and the court's independence was in question.
Yes.
And EU was trying to fine Poland. And
Yes.
who blocked it? Hungary. Similarly, Poland helped Hungary in many cases that it was actually violating certain European policies when it came to migration, for instance.
Absolutely. You're
Yeah.
absolutely right. And migration is a topic that I have not addressed yet. I mean, one
Yeah.
aspect, of course, with Poland is they then had an election and
Yeah.
the former right-wing government was outvoted. They now have the problem that the president is still right-wing and the new government cannot really be as pro-European as it wants to be because the
I
decisions are being
see.
blocked from the top. But of course, yeah, Hungary and Poland were absolutely playing together. Unfortunately, what we see with regard to migration, it's not only these countries, right?
Yeah.
This is something that is an overall EU problem and is, I mean, even more so in across the European Union. We have right-wing extremism and right-wing extremist parties rising. And in my view, the traditional center or center-left parties are right now not necessarily doing a good job in putting out their own profile, but rather
Hmm.
trying to catch up on these policies and trying to secure these voters instead of actually really showing an alternative. Although to show the alternative would, in my view, not be that difficult, especially if we see what's happening in the United States, especially if we see what has happened to the UK after
Yeah.
Brexit, rising prices, the economy in the United States, and so forth. So there is an argument for all these values that seem to be so idealistic, but they are not. I mean, they really serve a purpose, and the purpose is certainly economic and social well-being, trust, and long-term peace. I mean, I have not seen the country in the world where war
Yeah.
actually brought something good later, right? The
Yeah.
costs of war are extremely high, reconstruction and so forth. It's kind of think about it. Also, think
Yeah.
about your demographic situation. Perhaps you need immigrants.
But also at the
Immigrants.
same time, do you think immigration is the greatest pressure on democracy and democratic movements within the EU, or there are other things that actually overshadowed by the debate of migration?
I think there are issues that are overshadowed by the debate of migration, and migration is unfortunately always the poor animal that is being
Hmm.
used by right-wing parties because it seems to be sort of a catch-all topic, which is not very well analyzed. I mean, imagine, for example, in New York in the United States without
Yeah.
immigration, the whole city wouldn't function anymore. You can close it
Yeah.
and go somewhere else. It's almost insane if you look at Germany. Germany's economy is highly dependent on immigration if you look at demographics. So It's kind of, if you look at it from the pure money-making point, and the money-making point is always the argument with migration, basically, oh my God, they are stealing our social security. Well,
Yeah.
no, they're actually paying into our social security system if they are working here,
Yeah.
and they boost up those incomes. Plus, even there, a lot of immigrants, when they work here, they are not immediately entitled to the social benefits, right? So they are
Hmm.
paying the German population before, for several years before they're even entitled to get something out of the system. So it's kind of, can you please do your math? And unfortunately, people don't really talk about that. And I think this is exactly a very good example of I mean, not we, but certain politicians are running after the arguments of the AfD or other right-wing parties, just to secure their voters. And then, of course, you have other threats to democracy, which, for example, you also find online, where debates are highly polarized.
Yeah.
I would think that polarization is a big problem, and polarization doesn't leave room for the longer explanation, or perhaps for that calculation. I mean, if you see sometimes what voters are also buying simply by quick statements of politicians
Hmm.
that they read online, then you have to ask yourself, do you really just believe that? Don't you read up on that? Formerly, at least, we had qualitative journalism to actually test what politicians were saying, and you got most of your information through the newspaper, and you were questioning that. But now you're directly in social media contact with a Donald Trump or whatever,
Yeah.
and you tend to believe that. And this happens in a couple of seconds. Perhaps you do not listen to a podcast like ours, that will take 30 to 40 minutes or whatever,
Yeah.
and that actually takes time. If you really want to be informed, well, yes, you have to take the time, and I'm always a proponent of slowing down a little bit in that regard. And I see polarization as one of the biggest threats to democracy.
Absolutely. One of the factors I analyzed and observed in my line of work is that some of the sensitive topics for EU, especially for each member state, because they also have a lot of nuances of their
Yeah.
own societies and
Yes.
dynamics, which are totally different, is that it's foreign influenced polarization within each member state is also another thing.
Mhm.
One of the things recently, there was a publication about how migration, the topic of migration on social media, bringing all these old videos, unrelated videos, and then combining them, posting them at the same time to show that, okay, there are a particular group of migrants from particular nationality that
Mhm.
constantly doing these things that undermine EU culture, EU tradition, and so on, and we don't want them. Apparently, a lot of these activities were done outside of the EU. These posts were shared outside of the EU to undermine the European democracy and so put pressure and create polarization. And one of the things I think the big, and this is my question for you, is that do you think that EU itself is putting itself in a vulnerable position when it interacts with world leaders that are actually quite against the EU as a whole? Like, let's say Elon Musk wanted to fund the AfD party of Germany at some point, right?
So the question is, is the EU at risk because of that?
Do you think that's the biggest threat EU is facing compared to the security threat that it's facing at the
Uh,
moment?
I would say perhaps it varies across countries. From what I observe, there is also, yes, of course, Elon Musk wants to finance the AfD, but you will always find groups in the population who will not necessarily like that.
Hmm.
I do. This is probably, yes, it might be a threat for a short time, but it could be in the long run something that would actually play counter Elon Musk. That's a little bit similar perhaps to what has happened in Poland and Hungary. Yes, in the beginning, all of that sounded extremely attractive. But if you look at it in the longer run, people realize that this is not necessarily the good thing. Unfortunately, this takes a very long time right now. I would argue that without the EU, if you look at Poland or Hungary, if you had this situation without the EU, you wouldn't even have been able to change this, because at least the
Hmm.
EU was there to point out with the rule of law procedures and with legal cases, that there was a problem, and it was not just legal cases that were debated in a very high level, non-comprehensible era or whatever, or realm. These were cases that did affect the population. And I mean, if you
Hmm.
see the protests and the demonstrations that happened in Poland before the election, they were very much pro-EU, and they were very much aware of what was going on, being from the violation of gender equality rights when female judges had to retire earlier. It was just an easy way to get out of the enemies of the system. So you introduce early retirement for female judges. That's very much counter EU law. Or the whole restructuring of the judicial system with basically bodies that could control judges. And
Hmm.
then you had all these various legal cases, but finally one resulted actually in the fact that Poland was fined 1 million euro per day to pay to the European Union. So that was real. That was a real financial impact. 1 million per day is quite a lot of money. Poland is the country in the European Union that gets financially most out of it.
Yeah.
So it was not the case that, I don't know, the European Commission was waiting for Poland to wire the money. They simply withheld the funds.
Yeah.
1 million per day. And in practical terms, what does this mean? And this is where I would think there is a relationship between paper and actually practical work. This meant that, for example, when as a normal citizen or as a region or as a citizen or as a city, you apply for European regional funds, for example, or
Yeah.
for Erasmus funds. This is something that also Bard College Berlin gets, right? We get
Yeah.
Erasmus funds. But in the course of the application, kind of check whether your country complies with the EU values and so forth. So of course people saw it doesn't even make sense to send in my
Mm,
application, right? Because I won't get the money anyway.
I see.
And so this had a direct financial impact, and people were realizing that. And this is where the EU has, in my view, perhaps not a very strong, but still there is an enforcement mechanism to protect these values in member
Yeah.
states and also to make the people aware of it.
I see.
If you imagine a situation where this is not happening, well then, perhaps this can continue forever. And
Hmm.
this is a situation that we observe in the United States. There is no EU above it, right?
Yeah.
Basically, the whoever is running the country can pretty much do what they want. And even if it's not a perfect system that the EU has there, it is still a system that somehow works, and also that I would say Europeans believe in. If you look at the countries who want to join the European Union, I mean, they really believe in these values. There were
Especially
in Ukraine,
in the
there were
Balkan
protests
region.
for these values in Georgia and so forth. This is
Mm-hmm.
not, it's not an absurd fairy tale in that regard. So it's really something to aspire to. And I think especially also if we look at Eastern European states with the history of communism and authoritarian regimes, I think especially these countries know what they have there and what they get out of it.
Absolutely. Then what happens to EU values, especially when security and geopolitical interests take priority for the EU itself? How much are they able to implement those values?
So right now, if we look at foreign and security policy, the EU is very much reacting to what's happening. And I'm not
Mm,
talking about the group of heads of states and government. I'm really talking about commission and so forth. They can send humanitarian missions to countries where something has happened, a war
yeah.
has happened, or a humanitarian aid is needed or whatever. Then the EU can send EU missions. You have this in military training, you have this in development aid and so forth. But that doesn't mean what we perhaps in geopolitical terms would imagine as we are really influencing world policy here, right?
Yeah.
That doesn't really, that I would say is not really happening. This is for the time being very much happening at the national level. And yes, in an ideal world, when the EU leaders come together and decide on something.
Hmm.
For example, financial aid to Ukraine and so forth, or weapons to Ukraine and whatsoever. This is in no way anywhere near a full EU decision right now. And
Right.
probably because this is one of the core sovereign competencies of nation states, if this would be harmonized, as we say, so made a EU competency, this in itself, this decision would need an agreement of all the member states. And this is, of course, I would say right now, a very, very unlikely decision.
Mhm.
At the same time, given the geopolitical threats, perhaps we are closer to such a decision, right? Because you have to react. But then again, the question is, do you actually react quicker in
Yeah.
an EU setting or not?
Yeah.
Or is it perhaps quicker if we all come together and come up with some decisions, specifically since we also already have the structures of NATO.
I
So
see.
if you do or invent some kind of EU harmonized system, this would be in addition to what you already have, where you are already coordinating.
Yeah.
Do you want that or not? How do you design this? That there are quite some questions attached to that.
Yeah. Um, Another thing would be to understand how each member state within the EU actually have the influence across other member states, and in terms of economics, investments, its own projection of power, its industries. Of course, we have countries like Germany,
Mhm.
France, Italy that were part of like founding fathers or part of the founding members of the EU in the beginning, right?
Mhm.
But what do you think from your observation, which country at the moment is rising on the top that wasn't part of this league?
Well, I mean, one country is clearly Poland, given the situation of the country,
Mhm.
of the country. In Central Europe and very, very close to Russia. Absolutely, very, very key. Also one of the biggest countries. Other than that, of course, you will always have the financial question, right?
Mm,
And Germany is one of the contributing or the contributing member states. So there is, of course, this impact. And this is, for example, what we talked about before, the fact that Poland was fined 1 million euros per day. This is also an argument where you could actually say this is benefiting
mhm.
the richer countries, right? If this is something that would have happened to Germany, perhaps they wouldn't have been that affected
Yeah.
and would not have cared. For them, the risk of not complying with those values is less, financially speaking.
Yeah.
However, there is always the aspect of that trade narrative,
I
and
see.
especially if you are Germany and you are an export country, an export oriented country, Germany needs that market.
Mm,
And in the end, they will have that interest, and they also carried decisions that they were not in favor of because they needed this market access. Even if you look at Hungary, I mean, Orban was never as extreme as a Donald Trump. He tried to disguise it some way.
yeah. Yeah.
So they were always, every member state, yes, of course, they want to show to their population that they're leading the game there and so forth, and that they are strong. But after all, it's always kind of a compromise of both sides. And I would say that even a Hungary under Orban had an interest to stay in the European Union.
And also the energy crisis as well, that also
Yes.
defined some of these relationships. And I think Hungary, one of the rationale it had was that, okay, it was dependent on the Russian energy part, but also politically trying to avoid those sabotage attacks that are happening across Europe, which it's hard to connect them to a country sometimes. But of
Yes.
course, there are players who are active, who are constantly trying to undermine the EU in European countries, those who are involved in war. And this was one of the towards the criticisms towards Germany in the beginning of the Russian aggression of Ukraine, that Germany was not providing military aid. The first thing they provided was 5,000 helmets for
Yeah.
Ukrainian soldiers.
Yeah.
But of course, they increased it later into different other areas. So I think energy is also crucial for EU itself. So I think in the past few years, it's no longer migration that is the debate, but energy crisis, I would say.
That will absolutely be one of the key topics. And talking about energy and Germany and already the energy dependency of Germany from Russia. This was, for
Yeah.
example, something that was highly criticized by other EU member states and also by the European Commission. And it was then marketed a little bit as, oh my God, they are all jealous of us because we get this now. Well, here we are. And there is, I don't know where this is coming from, but also if you look at one other security aspect, you were alluding to this before, influence also via the internet and
Yeah.
hacking and so forth.
Information warfare.
Exactly. Germany is in a way very oblivious to that,
Mm,
and almost sometimes I feel as if this is not happening.
Yeah.
acting as if this is not necessarily happening. So, of course, I think the countries that are out there and that very close to Russia, for example, have a very different relationship to that. But
Yeah.
again, for that to have the platform of the European Union is extremely helpful. And
Yeah.
the European Commission is certainly aware of that. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And on that aspect of information warfare is one thing that I'm seeing in Germany. There aren't much funding around that as well, like on how to counter that. Of course, a lot of media organizations, they do their own journalistic work to say like certain campaign was ongoing on social media, or this was debunked, that was debunked.
Mm.
But on a larger scale, they're not as much invested as France is invested. They're not as much as invested as the UK, especially.
Yes.
And for our organization, that's one of the challenges, because we work around that area of how information work and how information could be weaponized in many different ways. And on that, what we see is that one of the observations and analysis of the current Iran and US conflict was that Iran may have lost or resisted the American attacks, but they won something. They won another game, and that was the trolling game, online trolling and information game, because this was the first time a country activates its embassies as means of trolling other countries, not in a diplomatic way, but rather in a very like just a normal person posting stuff about
Mm. Mm.
another president or member state.
Yes.
One example could be that Donald Trump said we want to do regime change in Iran. Later on, when there was some reshuffling within the Trump administration, of they removed some of the generals, Iranian embassies around the world, especially the ones in Zimbabwe and South Africa, they were posting, oh, they wanted to do regime change, but their regime change, the regime change happened in White House. Of course, this might sound cool in a way, but the impact it has on people's perception is massive.
Of
And
course.
these sort of examples are way more extreme, hard on various topics in the EU, from Russia, from other countries. And talking about EU again and Iran, I think there was a pressure on the EU member states, some of the member states or EU as a whole, to join the war against Iran with Israel and the US as well. So how should we understand, especially that we don't know much about EU institution as much as you do, that you have studied it. How should we understand EU's position on the crisis involving Iran?
Yeah, in general, there is no EU position, which brings us back to the original problem. You will have
Mhm.
different positions from the member states. I mean, you have Germany and Spain on the one hand that basically say we do not engage in any war. We want some kind of diplomatic solution and so forth, which is also what the Commission president has said. Of course, the Commission president cannot say anything else
Yeah,
because the Commission president is not or doesn't have the authority to do anything else. If
yeah,
Ursula von der Leyen would go out and say, oh, yeah, the EU countries or the Commission will deploy something, well, that's great if she says this, but she cannot do it. So
mm,
you will probably not hear anything else from her. And you will have to go to every single member state and ask them for their position, unless we have a unified European Union foreign policy that might change. And this is certainly one of the problems there. We also hear, I mean, from Donald Trump, the EU has to step up and the EU has to organize its defense and so forth. And it's always, I mean, he certainly has a point, but what he doesn't mention, of course, is that it was the United States in the beginning that didn't want Europe to build an army again. So there is a reason for that, right? Why Europe,
especially
why
Germany.
especially Germany, and no one had an interest that Germany would rearm. So there is certainly a change in that regard, and I think also the German perception with regard to Ukraine might be changing on that matter. The aspect of information extremely important. What you mentioned, both with regard to foreign and security policy, but basically when we talked about the rise of right-wing extremism in the beginning, yeah, basically when it comes to every election and also when it comes to every European election,
Right.
when it comes to every national election. This is also why I always say, be careful when you think about democracy and voter participation. A lot of people make the mistake to say, oh, there was a lot of voter participation and therefore we're all democratic.
Okay.
No, The only thing, and this is, guys, it's kind of a look at the numbers you're looking at. The only thing that this number tells you is how many people actually voted. No one tells you what they voted. And
Yeah.
most of the time, a high voter turnout correlates with extremist votes,
Yeah.
which was also the case in the last European election. So, I mean, that is basically across the whole bank. And with regard to Iran, I mean, I cannot really give you the definite answer on that, simply because there is not really an position.
As an example, it could be taken as an example that if crises of such are happening around the world,
Hmm.
generally, does you have a position, unified position, or they have multiple positions within each member state, and then they may have come together for a joint response?
I mean, well, with crisis to that extent, what you usually have is that a couple of EU member states respond
Right.
jointly, and some of them don't care, or I don't know what. And this is basically also, this is another aspect of foreign policy, and perhaps why it's so difficult to harmonize that. If you look at the various member states, Belgium's foreign policy
Mhm.
as a former colonial power is worlds apart from Poland.
Right.
They have totally different interests and
Yeah.
probably couldn't care less. That's one side. The other side is, well, but they should care more, right? Because of course, what is happening with the information warfare and so forth, the world is just more connected. And this would also be the argument for a stronger European Union presence in that sense. And if you think about the defense of all these values that we talked about, yes, of course, then this is the argument for working together in that regard. Perhaps this needs a generational change or another type of politician right now. I would say the obliviousness is declining, but it's not where it should be right now. And
I
some
see.
countries definitely have to step up, and Germany is one of them.
Interesting, interesting. Dr. Berit, for the future, if anything, what gives you hope about the democracy and the state of democracy in EU?
What gives me hope, as I said in the beginning, the people, and I would still think that there is no better alternative.
Mm.
It has been proven that, the authoritarian regimes have not necessarily provided people with what they actually wanted. And looking at Eastern Europe, this is actually a nice proof of it. The European Union is in so far a success model because it has achieved its goal. The goal was no war between its member states. It's been over 70 years now. This has never happened in European history before,
Mm.
that these countries were not at war with each other. So there are achievements, but it doesn't mean that we should always aim higher. And perhaps now is a very good moment to do so, and also to be actually a very good sort of counter entity to those countries that formally promoted democracy and the rule of law. I mean, by now we're almost woke and
Yeah,
alternative in
yeah.
doing this. But I don't know if you've seen it recently. The majority of the people of Canada have expressed the wish to join the European Union. So, I mean, come on, there
The
is some positive stuff
transatlantic EU.
here.
And on that note, thank you so much for being a guest at Intelligence Spotlight.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.